like to start by thanking the organisers of this event for inviting me to make a presentation. When Kama Punsok first invited me to attend the conference and to make a contribution, I felt I didn't have time to do that because I'm working on a book on Mandala principle. But then it occurred to me, I could actually offer a presentation on that topic, which Kama Punsok immediately took me up on. I haven't been able to attend in person, unfortunately, which I regret, but at least we have the opportunity for me to give my talk online and to answer questions at the end, I hope. So, yes, the book I was planning wasn't particularly academic in approach. It's very much based on principles that were laid out by Rigzin Shikpo of the Longchen Foundation, with whom I worked for many years, and developed a course of study in which we focus quite a lot on the idea of Mandala principle, with 9 principles that Rigzin Shikpo drew out from the teachings of Trungpa Rinpoche. And these have turned out to be very useful for teaching students at every level, a very unifying concept. But Trungpa Rinpoche insists this isn't a conceptual principle at all. It's purely experiential, and he doesn't really, in his book Openness of Orderly Chaos, Mandala Principle, he doesn't actually spell out what a mandala is. He says what it isn't, and various times when he's asked what it is, he'll give different answers. Answers like it's an organizational principle, a gestalt, an organizational pattern. One time he said it was time, which is very interesting. One time he says it's connections or relationships, and so on. So, okay, he says we're not talking about diagrams, we're not particularly at this point talking about deities or patterns, geometric patterns. So it's a question that's left hanging there, and over the years I've noticed that the word mandala is used, or yes, another term he uses for it is societies, or but over the years I noticed that Tibetans just use the word mandala, a center and a periphery, just in ordinary language. And many of the teachings in Buddhism actually can be expressed in terms of mandala, especially when you have it drawn out, the principles drawn out in the way Rigzin Shikpo has done, where you've got a central principle that determines what the mandala is, and then a boundary which marks what is in the mandala and what is not in the mandala, and the emotionality of that boundary. Are you talking about an energy exchange with what's inside and what's outside, and the different levels of hierarchy within, which are nearer the center or further from the center, a dynamic of focus and spreading, and guardians and messengers and gates and so on. And these principles are found in everything in your life. You don't need to have any deep philosophical view to be able to orientate yourself towards these principles. And this is a point that Trungpa Rinpoche makes again and again in Orderly Chaos, that he's not talking about a theory, he's not talking about philosophy, he isn't talking particularly about an enlightened point of view, he's just talking about our life and how this applies to our life, and that the principles of the mandala are in fact themselves an expression of awakening, even while we're confused. So that we need to look at our confusion. We have to look at our suffering. We have to look at our pain. And rather than thinking about how to escape it, how to discover its origin, which of course takes us straight back to the Buddha's teachings on suffering, the noble truth of suffering. First, you have to understand suffering. This is a theme that Srimala Devi also picks in the Srimala Devi Sutra. Also, she makes this point. You have to understand suffering. If you don't understand suffering, then you don't get to see the dhatu. You don't get to see cessation, or you don't get to see the Dharmata, whatever kind of technical term you want to use. And Trungpa Rinpoche makes this point throughout. But what's interesting is he calls the obscuring process, if you like, the 12 links of Paticca Samuppada on the very first page of the book, he talks about these are a mandala. This is a mandala that we are creating. And that's an interesting theme throughout the book, is what is the we, what is the self, what is the ego, and how he's using the language in quite a revealing manner. So you've got a mandala of suffering, or dukkha. And why call it a mandala? We call it a mandala because the 12 links actually are all of a piece. They come together all of a piece. And Trungpa Rinpoche uses the word as a totality. And I tend to use the expression all of a piece to get that sense of it's all of a piece. You can't break it up. If you can break it up, then it becomes something relative. It becomes something that is impermanent and changing and unreliable. So reality is always all of a piece. I think this is probably a way of translating Shlundrup in Tibetan, which is used a lot in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen teachings. So he's stressing that there is this mandala of confusion, and there's the corresponding mandala of nirvana, or whatever you want to call it, that they both spring from the same base. And he talks a lot about this base, this ground, if you like, which is a very Dzogchen way of talking, although he mostly refers back to tantras and the tantric view. This relates very strongly to his also calling that solid. So he talks a lot about space and solid space, which is perhaps somewhat sort of counterintuitive, but quite challenging from the experiential point of view. So this relates very much to what I say in my abstract about, well, what's he talking about really in terms of reality? He specifically says that he's not talking about Madhyamaka. He's talking about what I would call post-Madhyamaka, where you're talking about what's real, what's really there. And this is quite unusual, and he makes some quite striking statements, such as this one here, which jumped out at me. On page 84, he says, student says, on the non-dualistic level, can there be such things as Buddha families and prajna and the world of distinctions? And Rinpoche says, that's exactly what we have been saying is the case in this talk. The level of non-dual reality is the realm of jnana. Therefore, there is discriminating awareness, wisdom happening all the time. On that level, there is, in fact, a living world, a much more living one than we are experiencing. And the student says, it sounds like there would be a contradiction there, because to discriminate is to find duality. And Trungpa Rinpoche says, there's no problem with finding duality. We're speaking here of the relative world in purely psychological terms. We're talking about relative fixation, relative hang-ups, rather than seeing things as two. That is not regarded as dualistic fixation, but still as discriminating awareness. I mean, an enlightened person is able to go down the street and take his bus. As a matter of fact, he can do it much better than we can because he's always there. So this sense that there is a reality there in all its richness and depth and its energy and so on, which to me is what it's saying in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra and what Dolpopo is saying when he's talking about this extreme Shentong, that the world really does exist. And what we think of as real, which you might call relative, never did exist. And so, although Trungpa Rinpoche is not particularly referring to the Jonangpas and Dolpopo, nonetheless it very much conforms with what I was kind of looking for in the Ratnagotra Vibhaga as a, if you like, an extreme Shentong interpretation of what the qualities are, that they're inseparable, yes, and in the Ratnagotra Vibhaga it says they're inseparable from awakening, from the awakened state, from the Buddha, when the Buddha has all these qualities. But the extreme Shentong would say, we have already all the qualities of a Buddha. And I'll leave it there, as hope that you will come back to me with some questions.